Hello, and welcome to the Morris-Jumel Mansion. My name is Megan Burns, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the museum. This is an exciting time as we embark on a new period of reinterpretation and research to share the stories of people commonly left out of the historical narrative, including women, African Americans, and Native peoples. Thanks to a project funded by Humanities New York, we are able to continue our work with select community scholars and historians to highlight the stories of Black individuals connected with the historic site, including people who were enslaved and free. This project is essential for Morris-Jumel Mansion to continue its work to help make history relevant for our audiences and to empower our community to see themselves reflected in the museum's spaces and its storytelling. One of the questions that we commonly get asked at Morris-Jumel Mansion is, did the Morris family own enslaved people? In this video, community scholar and longtime Morris-Jumel docent Gregory Washington shares his research about the lives and contributions of people who were enslaved in Manhattan during the Dutch and English colonial periods, including evidence that the Morris family did own people who lived and worked in this house. He discusses how central Black labor was in the building of New York City's infrastructure and explores the likelihood that the Morris-Jumel Mansion was also constructed by enslaved people as a summer home for the elite Morris family. There is much that we still don't know and have yet to discover about the lives of people, both enslaved and free, who were an essential part of the history of this house, this city, and this nation. The research continues.
For those of you who don't know me, I am a docent at Morris-Jumel Mansion for the past 17 years. And the title of my presentation this afternoon is Eliza Jumel Died in a House Built by Slaves. And this is basically a discussion of the slave narrative in the village of Harlem, in New York City in general, but with a particular emphasis on Harlem and the Morris-Jumel Mansion from the period of the 1630s up until 1827. 1827 is when we have the emancipation of slaves in the state of New York. So basically, where I want to start is at the very beginning. And what I want to say is that, like all children in the 4th grade in New York City schools, I learned about New York's history. And we learned about the Dutch coming here in the 1600s. We learned about the streets names here in New York, that some of them have Dutch names as a result. We learned that the British took over 40 years later in 1664, but we never really learned to whom the credit for New York City as a great metropolis really goes to. Who did the backbreaking work of building the roads, constructing farms, houses, et cetera, et cetera. And as you can already guess, that credit goes to the African slaves that came here. One of the great things that I learned initially was most New Yorkers did not know that slaves existed in New York City. Up until 1991, the great majority of New Yorkers and visitors to New York were under the impression that slavery was a total Southern phenomenon. This was not the case. As a matter of fact, the city of New York was only second to Charleston, South Carolina, in terms of the slave trade. Why do I say 1991? Because it was in the spring of 1991, down on Reed Street near Broadway in Lower Manhattan. A construction project was in progress. The foundation was being dug up and excavated, and the excavation revealed human remains. This portion of New York City is today known as the African Burial Ground. As soon as the bones were dug up, people started doing the research and determined that right there on Reed Street, Reed and Duane, was an African burial ground. Now, in its totality, 419 remains were dug up at that time. A great majority, somewhere between 40 and 50% of those remains, were those of children. The remains give a haunting indication of New York's past. In addition to the remains, we see shards of pottery. We see things like cowrie shells that had been buried along with those Africans. The cowrie shells, for those of you who do not know, sometimes you'll see African Americans wearing seashells around their neck, around their wrists as bracelets. The cowrie shell at one time was used as currency. As a matter of fact, in the country today known as Ghana, their currency is called the CD, and CD is the Akan name for cowrie. So we saw these. We saw one where there was a young woman buried with her child. The woman was under DNA analysis about 27 years old, and she had a waist bracelet around her abdomen, and it was adorned with cowrie shells. So this indicated that she was a woman of perhaps maybe high esteem, even perhaps of significant wealth. Millions of New Yorkers walked along Duane Street, along Reed Street, never knowing that they were actually walking on top of an African burial ground. As of 2007, we have come across another burial ground, this one in East Harlem on East 126th Street, where there's a bus depot. That burial ground might predate the one that was on Reed Street. We believe the one on East 126th Street, it dates back to 1660, when the Dutch Reformed Church was located on East 123rd Street. By the way, that church is still there on East 123rd Street. It is a predominant African-American congregation, but it still maintains its Dutch Reformed Church roots, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. Another thing that was significant for me in doing this research, and I've been researching New York City's African history since I've been a docent at Morris-Jumel, was in 2007, in July of 2007, New York Magazine had a cover article entitled, "Whose Harlem Is It?" And those of you who are New York City residents know that by 2007, the gentrification that's going on in Harlem was in full effect. It was dividing people along economic, class, social lines, etc. The cover subject, the young woman that was interviewed for the article, was a local real estate agent in Harlem. And in one of her statements, she mentioned that when African Americans told her that Blacks had always been in New York City and always been in Harlem, she said, "Well, I have to go back and tell them, we weren't here, dear. We didn't even lay the bricks." So knowing what I had known by 2007, I decided I'm going to prove her wrong. And I think I have. So let's go to the next slide. And the next slide shows you simply chains. These are the chains that the first enslaved persons who came to New York City which was then New Amsterdam in 1626. This is what was about their ankles and about their wrists as they got off the boats in New York Harbor and were processed and brought here to start their lives as New York City's first municipal workforce. So in the beginning, 11 African men are brought to New York City. Now, these men were not imported directly from Africa. What had happened was a Dutch ship in the Atlantic intercepted a Portuguese vessel. These 11 men were on that Portuguese vessel. And in an act of what some people refer to as piracy, the vessel was confiscated by the Dutch and the 11 men brought here to New Amsterdam. One of the remarkable things about these 11 men is we know their names. And if we could go to the next slide. Just wanted to show you, this is Sylvain Terrace. All of you who are docents here know about Sylvain Terrace. You know this is the carriage entrance to the mansion. But when I was growing up in this community, and I just live around the corner from the mansion, I've lived around the corner since I was born here. We as children were always taught that these were the slave quarters. They were pretty nice in terms of slave quarters when you compare them to the slave quarters at Monticello, at Mount Vernon, and all the other plantations in the South. It was quite the shock to find out that these were way past the period of slavery, way past the period of indentured servitude in New York City. So I told you that these 11 men came in 1626. And I also said that the remarkable thing is we know their names. And you'll see they're listed. The first name you see is Anthony Portuguese. The next one is Manuel Groot. The third one is Anthony Congo, etc., ending with Paul Dangola. They all have, with the exception of Clen Manuel, they all have saints' names. This is an indication that it is highly likely they were baptized when they were captured. Baptism, the sacrament of baptism, was a significant thing for the Dutch. When these men eventually get their freedom some 20-something years, 18 years later, they are made to promise to make a gentleman's agreement that they will be baptized in order to keep their freedom, and that they will baptize their children as well. Even though their children had to remain enslaved, they used baptism as a form of condition that if you remain baptized, you can remain free. The surnames give you an indication of where these men came from in the world. Most of these names are either Portuguese or Spanish. Which means that some of these men may have come from places like Angola, which had already been colonized by the Portuguese, or some of them had been captured by Spanish vessels in the Atlantic and converted to Catholicism and then given these names. In terms of slavery in New York City, when it comes to slavery as an institution, those 11 men become the first municipal workforce. They clear the land, they build the fort, they build what we call Wall Street, they build hospitals, they build houses. Initially, they belonged to quote unquote, the company. In other words, the Dutch West India Company. It is only with the passage of time that, and with more slaves being brought in, that slaves are bought and purchased for the use of individual colonists. But primarily in the beginning, the enslaved Africans that came here were here to cultivate what we now call the city of New York. They were used to pave what is called Stone Street in 1654. They built the wall that gives Wall Street its name in 1653. They dredged Canal Street in order that the little boats could pass from east to west. The Hospital of the Upper Room was on Cortlandt Street. It was a 2-story house. And this was a hospital that was built for the Dutch militia and for the enslaved. The enslaved, when they were ill, would go upstairs. The military men would be taken care of downstairs. This hospital is a forerunner of today's Bellevue Hospital. They build Trinity Chapel and they build St. Paul's Chapel. St. Paul's Chapel is famous for when the Revolutionary Wars ended, George Washington went and knelt down and prayed a prayer of thanksgiving after the war. Trinity Church is now in the process of digitalizing all its records of its slave past. They have receipts for the enslaved people that helped to build that church. Many of the enslaved who were not a part of an individual ownership worked as day laborers. they would go to what was called the meal market. And the meal market was at the foot of Wall Street and Water Street. And it sat right there facing the East River. And they could go there and rent themselves out for the day to a farmer, to a local business owner. If one of the wheelwrights or the coopers needed help, they could go, and the wheelwright or the cooper would pay for their fee for the day and get the assistance of these enslaved persons. Who would get the fee? Certainly not the enslaved person. It was his master that would get this fee. Or in the case of the Governor General, whoever it was, Wouter Van Twiller or Peter Stuyvesant at the time, they would pocket the fee. By 1711, there are so many slaves in New York City. About 25% of the population is enslaved, and a very small part of the population is free. But 25% of the enslaved population is significant, and people start to get nervous. People start to conjure up rumors and stories of a potential revolution on the part of the enslaved. So an ordinance was passed on December the 17th of 1711 that if you were enslaved, you had to go somewhere to be processed, and that first place was the meal market. Following the meal market, a place called the Tanteen Coffee House was built. What is a Tanteen? A Tanteen is sort of an insurance scheme. Several people pay into it, and as the individual subscribers die off, leaving one, that one person gets what is left of the proceeds of the insurance. So the Tontine Coffee House, again, which is right there on Water Street facing the East River, this is where taxes were paid. It is the forerunner of the New York Stock Exchange. This is where, when the slaves and other goods such as cotton, spices, wines, etc., when they come into the port of New York, these dry goods and the enslaved are processed at the Tontine Coffee House. Stephen Jumel, who, as you all know, was a well-to-do French wine merchant, probably would have had the wines that he had brought in from France processed at the Tontine Coffee House. The Tontine Coffee House is torn down sometime around 1762 to make way for New York's first urban renewal project. The first slave auction in North America happens in New York City at Cortlandt Street in 1665. And this portrait shows you what that looked like. Next slide. So this is a map of Harlem, and it's a map specifically of East Harlem. It's showing you, and this is about 1670, after the British had taken over. It's just before the Dutch come back and take over the island of Manhattan in 1673 again. But this is showing you different parts of Harlem, some of which are still in existence today. You'll see, going from right to left, the avenues are numbered first, second, third. There's a fourth avenue, which today we call Lexington Avenue. And it's going from your left, it starts at 116th Street, and it goes as far north as 125th Street. Way at the top, you'll see lot number 1, and it's labeled as Yoakum Peters' land. And then the other one says Turner's land. Yoakum Peters is one of the first patroons that get about 200 acres of property in Harlem. His property line starts somewhere around 127th Street, and it ends around 161st Street. He plants tobacco, he plants peaches. He brought with him a significant amount of livestock in terms of cows, horses, hogs, etc. He brought a buddy with him from the Netherlands. The buddy's name was Jonas de Bronk. The Buddy was given a patroonship of about 200 acres across the East River in the borough we know today that carries his name, called the Bronx. Down where the map shows 118th, 119th Street, this area of East Harlem is called Snake Hill for obvious reasons. It's an area that was just inundated with snakes. This is the area where New York City builds in the 19th century one of the water towers on top of a hill. And not a water tower, a fire tower. And that fire watchtower is still there today. The church farm belongs to the Elmendorf Church, on Dutch Reformed Church on 123rd Street. Apparently the church grew their own livestock, their own produce, and it was sort of a cooperative that they would have only their members were able to come and shop for provisions there. To your right, all the way under where it says Turner's Land, you'll see something that says Graveyard. That is 126th Street and 2nd Avenue, and that's where the other African burial ground is today. Construction on the new bus terminal, that was a bus depot that was supposed to be built there, has stopped. And the Elmendorf Church is in the process of negotiating with the MTA and with the city on landmarking that area and then digging up the rest of the remains that are under there, sending them to Howard University, to the anthropology department to be examined, and then having them reinterred someplace. The original 419 from the Duane Street site, some of them were reinterred in West Africa in Ghana, and others were interred at Trinity Church Cemetery down here on 155th Street. Can we go to the next slide? So, enslaved in the village of Harlem. There has always been African Americans, either in free people of color, which were a very small group, or enslaved Africans in Harlem since the 1630s. They worked on the farms, did municipal work. The slaves by around 1650s are very widely sought after by the landed gentry of Harlem in the 1600s. Governor General Wouter Van Twiller and Willem de Kieft, who had difficulty with the native Lenape population, used the enslaved persons as a buffer. And part of the land that they gave the enslaved on what is now Canal Street and Washington Square Park was in effect to keep the native persons from coming down from the north of Manhattan into Fort Amsterdam. Governor Peter Stuyvesant himself, by the time he's the Governor General, makes significant promises to the landed gentry of Harlem that he will do his best to get a number more and more slaves to come to Harlem to cultivate the land, to work on the farms. The official birthday for the village of Harlem is March the 3rd, 1658. This is when Peter Stuyvesant convened a council together and made the promise that a wagon road would be built from the village of Harlem into the fort so that the colonists could freely travel between the two villages for whatever their needs dictated. If we could go to the next slide. Here is yet another map of Harlem. This map begins somewhere around 106th Street, around where Hellgate is today, where Randall's Island and Ward's Island are. This map was drawn by hand by James Riker. James Riker, and the name tells you who he is, Rikers Island is named after his family, not after him specifically, but he is someone who was a Harlem resident and wrote a significant history of the village of Harlem from its very beginnings up until the late 1800s. In this map, once again, you'll see all the way over by where it says the Hudson River, you see Joachim Peter Keeter's land. You see at the very top where it curves, this is called Tubby Hook. Today we call it Inwood, but for many years it was called Tubby Hook. And the space between Tubby Hook is the Spuyten Duyvil. Then you'll see where it's on the East River or Harlem River side, you'll see Westchester County. Harlem was New York City's suburbs. And so for many, many years, anything north of Harlem was considered Westchester County. I was asked earlier today, where does Harlem begin? Where does it end? What are the geographical boundaries? And my answer to that is, it depends, number one, on where you are in Harlem, whether it's East Harlem or West. If you're in East Harlem, the southernmost boundary is East 96th Street. If you're on the west side, past Fifth Avenue, then the southernmost boundary is highly likely to be 110th Street. For many years, the northern boundary, up until 1970, was West 161st Street. But in 1970, Charles Rangel entertains a run for Congress against Adam Clayton Powell Jr. So the district lines were redrawn in order to help him gain the Hispanic vote at that time, because this is 1970. We have now a significant Dominican population above 155th Street, a significant Cuban population, and a significant Puerto Rican population. Charles Rangel himself is half Puerto Rican, and it was felt that he would benefit, and he did benefit because he won the election, if the district line was redrawn in his favor. You'll also notice on this map, and this shows you how old the map is, there are on the the easternmost portion, if you can see it, it says Little Brent Island and Great Brent's Island. That is Ward's Island and Randall's Island. Randall's Island was purchased in 1784 by a man named Jonathan Randall, and Ward's Island was purchased by two brothers, Bartholomew, and I think the other brother's name was Jonathan as well. Ward's Island, their father had been a Chief Justice of New York City during the colonial period. And then you see it's followed by Bronx land, or what is known today as the Bronx, or Morrisania. Morrisania because of the Morris family that predominated in that part of the Bronx at that time. There is a church on St. Anne's Avenue and East 140th Street in the Bronx. And in the crypt are members of the Morris family. I think Lewis Morris was someone who signed the Declaration of Independence, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. No relation to Colonel Morris of the Morris-Jumel Mansion, and no relation to the whoever Mount Morris is named after, Mount Morris Park is named after. There were a ton of Morrises, including the Morrises of Morris, New Jersey. They're all from different Morris clans. Under William de Kieft, the Governor General of the Dutch West India Company assigned to New Netherlands, in 1644, the 11 original enslaved Africans decide they want to be free. They feel that they have worked for free long enough. They feel that if New Amsterdam is a great place, that it is largely on their backs that it became great, and they petition William de Kieft for their freedom. William de Keith responds to them that it's not up to him entirely. He says that they should petition the West India Company. So among the 11, 3 of them boarded a ship, went back to the Netherlands, petitioned the Dutch West India Company, and the Dutch West India Company negotiated with the 11 that yes, you can be free, but only halfway free. Halfway meaning that in return for freedom, they had to give a portion of they would be given property in which to farm and live. They would no longer be required to work for free. They would get salaries. They would get updated skills in order to keep up with the times. And that in addition, they must agree to be baptized. Their marriages would be recognized by the Dutch Reformed Church, and they would be issued legal marriage certificates. But unfortunately, their children would remain enslaved. So rather than return with nothing, the 3 men agreed that this was the best that they could do, and this is what they returned to the other 8 men with. But by 1664, slavery now comes under the British, and it becomes much more harmful. For example, no more than 12 enslaved Africans may gather at a cemetery or a burial at one time. Burials can only take place in the daytime, preferably in the morning. This is totally against the West African culture's culture of burying at night. And then no more than 3 men can gather together on the street for casual conversation. And it gets worse. For example, some of the 11 men who now receive significant amounts of property, some of them received 12, 14. Big Manuel received 18 acres of property. Paul de Congo, the Flatiron Building at 23rd Street, where 23rd Street bisects and to the left becomes Broadway, to the right becomes Fifth Avenue. That was all at one time Paul de Congo's property. Under the British, this is snatched away from a significant number of these men. Time progresses, and the Phillips family and piracy comes into the picture. Frederick Phillips I became very, very wealthy on 2 endeavors: real estate and the slave trade. In terms of real estate, he amassed a total of about 52,000 acres, and we call that acreage Putnam County today. But he also dealt in slaves. He made an alliance with a man named Captain Kidd, who was a notorious slave trader. Captain Kidd was a notorious pirate. Captain Kidd would sail the Atlantic Ocean, sail the Indian Ocean, snatch someone else's ship, take the jewels, the spices, and whatever else, put it on his ship, then transfer those things to another ship, and then bring them to someone like Frederick Phillips, who would then sell these things at a great profit, and of course split a portion of it with Captain Kidd. Captain Kidd was a member of Trinity Church. There is a pew with his name on it in Trinity Church, but yet and still he was known as this pernicious seafaring pirate. In 1712 and in 1741, there were 2 great fires. In 1712, the fire was such that the slaves set the fire, and when the colonists came out to help put out the fire, the enslaved Africans pounced on them to kill them. 8 of those enslaved Africans admitted to it and were gibbeted. In other words, they were chained and then hung, and then their bodies left to rot so that all could see. And as an example to the other slaves, this is the fate that would happen to you if you decide to do such a thing. One of those enslaved persons was the slave that belonged to, one of the slaves that belonged to Frederick Phillips. Adolphus Phillips, his son, in 1741 was one of the court justices, and his enslaved person was involved in a great series of fires. Jill Lepore devotes an entire book in reference to this. Adolphus Phillips tries to help Cuffy and testifies on his behalf that he was a good slave. He never gave Adolphus any trouble, but the court would not hear of it, and Cuffy was also executed. Cuffy was not hanged, he was burned at the stake. Mary Phillips of Morris-Jumel Mansion fame, her father was Frederick Phillips II, and on his death, she had to share the 52,000 acres of property. And in addition, her father bequeathed to her 2 slaves, Sarah and Hannah. Mary Phillips, when she marries Roger Morris in 1758, there's no indication that slaves were a part of her dowry. But what is her relationship with the enslaved? Like many women in the 18th century, she is brought up with a rudimentary education. She learns her ABCs, but more importantly, she learns how to keep house. She learns sewing. She might even learn a musical instrument to entertain her family once she's a married woman with children. And she also has to learn the domestic science behind dealing with servants and enslaved Africans. So at around age 12, she would have learned very early on how to discipline, how to manage a household full of indentured servants, a household full of enslaved Africans, and what were the significant differences between the 2 groups. By 1689, we enter King William's War, and King William's War, the value of slaves increases. Why? Slaves are not reproducing at the rate it was hoped that they would. So as a result, and because there was a significant demand on slaves, the few slaves that were there, their prices go up exponentially. One of the questions I'm asked quite often in my tours at Morris-Jumel is, did enslaved persons build Mount Morris? Did they build the house? Did they cultivate the farm? Did they build the wagon road that leads from St. Nicholas Avenue to the house? And my answer is now yes. Hence the title of this project, Madame Jumel died in a house built by slaves. Enslaved people probably did highly likely build that house. Now, where did Roger Morris get the slaves? I don't believe that it was all of the slaves owned by himself and Mary Phillips Morris. He probably went down to the meal market or the Tanteen coffee house and hired the enslaved day laborers. And you could do that at that time. You could hire them for the hour, you could hire them for the day, or you could hire them for the week or for the month. And that is highly likely what had happened. By the time the Morris-Jumel Mansion construction begins in 1765, New York is in a recession. We are not doing well financially. So it's highly likely that in order to save money, it was better for him to rent the slaves rather than to purchase them outright. It probably was a cheaper endeavor for him all the way. And this is a picture of what Mary Morris would have looked like. And this is Phillipsburg Manor. This is the manor built by Frederick Phillips I. And this is where the mill is. This is actually called Upper Mills. The house in Yonkers near Getty Square is called the Lower Mills property. But at one time, it was all one big contiguous property extending from Spuyten Duyvil all the way up to the Connecticut border. Next slide. And this is what the main house looked like. It was a 2-story house, pretty Spartan inside. I've been inside a few times. One of the great things about it is it sits on a lake. It sits on a body of water. And as you can see in this photograph, the house is reflected right on the lake. This is a man named Caesar. And Caesar was enslaved by the Van Rensselaer family. The Van Rensselaer family owned the portion of, near Albany, the portion of land called Van Rensselaerwyck. But they also had property in Harlem, where the Benziger Mansion is today at 150th Street and Edgecombe Avenue, is where the Van Rensselaers had their property. Caesar had been their slave from the time he was a young teenager until his death many, many years later. I think Caesar at his death was about 108 years old at the time. The Van Rensselaers were a very enterprising family. Their daughter, Euphemia Van Rensselaer, was famous for, if you are of a certain age, you can remember back in hospitals, you would see young teenage women who were volunteers dressed in pink and white striped uniforms, and they were called candy stripers. At that time, student nurses wore a blue and white striped uniform. And Euphemia was a student nurse in Bellevue Hospital's first class of nurses in 1873. And she is the one who gets credit for inventing that blue and white or pink and white pinstripe uniform. She goes on from several years to become the night supervisor at Bellevue Hospital from 1876 to about 1879. And then she falls off the face of the earth for about 4 years. She turns up in documents at the St. Vincent's Hospital around 1882. She is now known as Sister Marie Dolores. She enters the convent of the Sisters of Charity and becomes a caretaker at what we call today the New York Foundling Home. Her brother, Philip Van Rensselaer, became a Roman Catholic priest. He later on becomes the Bishop of Dobbs Ferry, New York. The Van Rensselaer family still is in existence in the Albany area of New York today. So the Revolutionary War period. So we all know that the Morris-Jumel Mansion becomes the headquarters for the Battle of Harlem Heights. George Washington is in residence here for about 6 weeks. We know that his body servant, William Lee, follows him around throughout the Revolutionary War, and he rewards William Lee in his will. He names William Lee only of his more than 200 slaves as the one to be freed upon his death. People have asked me, and at one time I thought that William Lee lived at the New York City White House, which was at number 3 Cherry Street. This is not true. When George Washington becomes president of the United States in 1789, William Lee is trying to get here from Philadelphia to, from Mount Vernon to attend the inauguration and to help his master in the new home at Cherry Street. He gets as far as Philadelphia and he can't make it any further. He becomes ill. They send word to George Washington, your man Lee is here with us. He's not doing well. We don't think he should travel to New York. He'll never make it. What do you want us to do? And George Washington sent word back, no, tell him to stay there. As a matter of fact, if you can get him back to Mount Vernon, where he can recuperate properly, that's my preference. Some of the Mount Vernon slaves did come and work in the household in Cherry Street. And then when the seat of government and the White House is moved to Philadelphia, these same enslaved people go along with him. Ona Judge is present at Morris-Jumel for the July 10th dinner. She was the body servant for Martha Washington. So she would have helped Lady Washington fix her hair, put on her outfit, put on her hat, make herself presentable for the dinner, as well as taking care of the two grandchildren who were present at the dinner as well. Christopher Sholes was a cousin to William Lee, and he takes the place of William Lee as George Washington's body servant. Then there's Jenny. During the battle from Harlem Heights, if you go on loc.org, that is the Library of Congress's website, you will see all of George Washington's receipts for the time he lived at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. There are several receipts for laundry done by a young woman named Jenny. Jenny was handpicked by Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson was George Washington's sort of domestic supervisor. She was responsible for preparing meals, for keeping the servants in line, and for keeping house. And so it was Mrs. Thompson who was told, you need to go out and find someone to do the laundry. At one time, Mrs. Thompson is sent to do the shopping, and George Washington says, bring me back a receipt. And she fires back at him, how about in addition to the receipt, I bring back some help. I have to wash the dishes, prepare the food, do the butchering, etc., etc. I need help with all of this. And he tells her, fine, find some help, find good help, and it's not a problem. And so Mrs. Thompson is someone who has been lost to history. On a few people's vlogs and blogs, they discuss Mrs. Thompson. We don't know much in terms of her first name. Some people refer to her as Alice Thompson, but most people just refer to her as Mrs. Thompson. Was she literate? I don't know. I think she may have been. Was she African American? And if she was African American, was she free? Some have speculated that she was a free person of color of mixed race ancestry. This is a portrait of General George Washington. The young black man you see wearing the turban, he looks like he was about 17 years old. That is William Lee. So the Jumel period. The Jumels, we know, never owned slaves. I've been asked that. They moved into the house and take occupancy of the property in 1810. Slavery in the state of New York is not ending until 1827. Up until 1850, there are still people on the census, still people on the federal tax rolls, still listed as enslaved, because once slavery is ended, it's a slow manumission. It's done in degrees. So, does Eliza Jumel's early relationship with Blacks in Providence, Rhode Island inform her decision only to hire whites initially? I speculate that this is a big deal for Eliza. Eliza, because of her relationship with African Americans we are told in the brothel that she lived and worked in, because the brothel was an interracial brothel that serviced both Blacks and whites, because the women who did the servicing were Black and white, that this informed her decision to be part of a greater sisterhood, so to speak, and to not capitalize on someone else's misery. In 1850 or 1840, she puts in an advertisement for a coachman and a lady's maid in a local newspaper. And it's a very short classified advertisement. She simply says, I'm wanted, one coachman with experience, one lady's maid with at least 6 months experience, and her requirements are thus: good references, 6 months of experience in their past position, and they must be white. Why specifically did she specify that they must be white? Again, this is up for speculation. Some people believe that the landed gentry or wealthy persons, when they would hire only white servants, it meant that you made it, that you have so much money, you're so wealthy that you don't have to, that you can afford white servants. Yes, blacks cost less, but blacks were sort of the fashion of the day. The other thing also harkens back to both Stephen and Eliza. Eliza, because of her relationship in the interracial brothel, and then Stephen, we just don't know. We do know that he had a man named Jackson Williams that worked in his wine shop down on Liberty Street. But Jackson Williams was listed as free and was salaried. So the Jumels did not own slaves. In 1841, Madame Jumel takes a trip to Saratoga. She purchases a farm. She purchases a home there for herself. She's making the best of the good life. She meets a young woman named Anne Northrop. Anne Northrop is the wife of Solomon Northrop, whose husband has just been sold into slavery in Louisiana. And she's got 3 children to look after. In hearing Anne's story, Madame Jumel offers Anne an opportunity. She says to her, you have 3 children to look after. I need a cook at my home in Harlem. How about you come down to Harlem, live in my house, prepare meals for me like you do here at the United States Hotel. Your daughter Elizabeth can be my servant, my maid. Your daughter Margaret, I will have as a playmate for my granddaughter, and we'll apprentice out Alonzo to Mr. Carroll, and Alonzo can become sort of a junior footman with livery. And that's exactly what happened. So in 1841, the first of the Northrop children arrives at Morris-Jumel Mansion. That's Elizabeth. Elizabeth is somewhere between 10 and 12 years old at this time. And then Elizabeth, a few months later, is followed by her mother and her sister and brother. Many years later, when Eliza Jumel's will is in probate court, challenged by Nelson Chase on behalf of his children, it turns out that someone has told the probate court that a woman named Elizabeth Price, that's the married name of Elizabeth Northrop, can help with this case, that she has information that may sway the judge's decision. So in hearing this, Nelson Chase makes a beeline for Saratoga. Elizabeth is living in the Saratoga house of Madame Jumel. She's the caretaker, and along with her grandson or her son. Nelson Chase invites her to his suite of rooms at the United States Hotel. He has food ordered. He has champagne brought up. And he says, what is this nonsense that you were told by my mother-in-law that she had a son in Providence, Rhode Island? And Elizabeth says, quite frankly, that's what she told me. And that's what I'm prepared to tell the court. And he threatens her and tells her, if you decide to go along with this charade, then I am entitled to put you out on the street. And then what will you do? So she called his bluff, and he put her out on the street. Somehow, someone gave her the fare to go to New York City and to testify exactly what she told him, that Madame Jumel, in one of their talks, told her that she did have an illegitimate son in Providence, Rhode Island. Did it help the case for George Washington Bowen? No. But nonetheless, this young woman did testify on George Washington Bowen's behalf. In the Greif report, which all docents are required to read prior to becoming docents, this is a full description of this story is given there, and that's where I got that information. Next slide. So there you see a scene from 12 Years a Slave. The man in the first portrait is Solomon Northrop, and then the woman in the next slide is Anne Northrop. So this brings us to the end, the conclusion. And this GIF is how I felt a few months ago when the COVID happened and we were all under lockdown. This is Hillary Clinton, and she is Secretary of State. She's testifying in reference to the bombing of one of the State Department embassies in North Africa. And she's in very self-righteous indignation saying, "What difference does it make, Senator?" And when I think of the history of Blacks from the colonial period up to now, I think about two questions, two philosophical questions: what's become of us and what's to become of us. And when someone posed the "what's to become of us" question to me a few months ago, I felt like Hillary Clinton at that time, and in self-righteous indignation, I said, well, what difference does it make anyhow? We have COVID, the world is about to end, so what's to become of us? We're all gonna die from the COVID. And of course that didn't happen. So that's making light of this situation. Next slide. So what's become of us? The man on your left, dressed in judicial robes, is Bruce Wright. He is commonly known, and he lived in this neighborhood. He lived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue just before he died, and he raised his children there. He's part of the Harlem Renaissance in many ways. He was a poet. He collaborated with Langston Hughes on several projects of recorded poetry, spoken word poetry. In the newspapers, he was called Turn 'em Loose Bruce, because if you were African American or Latino and were brought before Judge Wright, you can be guaranteed that he would find some reason to either lower your bail or to have your case dismissed, and hence the name Turn 'em Loose Bruce. To your right is May Edward Chin. May Edward Chin also was from 409 Edgecombe Avenue. May Edward Chin has the distinction of being the first Black woman to graduate from NYU School of Medicine around 1930, I think, maybe even before then. I think it was before then. I think it was during the 20s. And she is most assuredly a part of the Harlem Renaissance, but a part of the Harlem Renaissance that's not always lauded. We think about the musicians, the writers, the sculptors, the artists, but we very rarely think of the thinkers like May Edward, Dr. Chin. Dr. Chin had a private practice in the lobby of 409 Edgecombe Avenue, and she also was a cancer researcher. In addition to being the first woman to graduate from NYU School of Medicine, Black woman to graduate from there, she is the first woman, Black or white, to gain an internship at Harlem Hospital when they started to open internships to women and men of color. Next slide. The man on your left also is a part of the Harlem Renaissance. That's Conrad Vincent. And Conrad Vincent had a hospital of his own in Harlem on what is now West 137th Street and 7th Avenue. It's still a healthcare facility. I think the proper address is 2460 7th Avenue. When he owned it, it was called the Conrad Vincent Sanitarium. It was a brand new 5-story building. It had 4 operating rooms. It had a pharmacy, a laboratory. The pharmacist there made his own aspirin. Some of the other drugs that were popular of the day, he made them himself so that the hospital could get the profits and flip them. Dr. Vincent interned at Bellevue Hospital in urology. But when his internship was finished, they wouldn't take him on as an attending. He tried to get a position at Harlem Hospital. Harlem Hospital turned him down. He went to Washington, D.C. and interned at a hospital there, Howard University Hospital, and then came back to determined to make a life for himself in New York. He came back and opened his own hospital. The woman on your left is a nurse midwife whose name escapes me, but she too is part of the Harlem Renaissance. She could not get into a midwifery school here in New York City. She's an alumnus of the Harlem Hospital Training School for Nurses in the 1930s. She went to the South, went into a nurse midwifery program in Georgia, got her diploma, and she decided to stay, and she became a midwife in rural South Carolina and delivered babies in people's homes. And this is a scene from a birth that she did in Edgefield, South Carolina. Edgefield, South Carolina has the distinction of being the home of Strom Thurmond. And it's also the family seat of my maternal family in Edgefield. My great-great-grandfather had a farm there that was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 110 acres long. So anytime I hear about Edgefield, South Carolina, I perk up immediately. Next slide. So where are we today? In Harlem, especially in our small neighborhood in Jumel Terrace, you'll see in the upper left corner a picture of Debbie Allen. Debbie Allen was is an actress and dancer. Her sister is Felicia Richard, who was famous for The Cosby Show. Debbie Allen lived in one of the townhouses on 162nd Street in the very early 1980s, from about 1979 to 1982. Then you see Duke Ellington with Mahalia Jackson. A lot of people do not know that in the 1950s, Duke Ellington and Mahalia Jackson collaborated on an album together called Come Sunday. It's a very, very beautiful album. I have my father's original copy of it in my possession. The man that you see at the bottom is Mercer Ellington. That's Duke Ellington's son. Mercer Ellington was a fantastic musician in his own right. The man all the way to your right, that's Larry Neal. That's Evelyn Neal's husband. Larry Neal was part of the Black Arts Movement, and he was along with Amiri Baraka, whose son is the mayor of Newark today. They made up the Black Arts Movement, and Larry Neal was a significant member of the Black Arts Movement in the late 60s, early 70s. Next slide. That's Stanley Nelson. That's the brother of Jill Nelson, and he is a documentarian in Harlem. That's all I'm going to say. I don't think I need to say any more about Stanley. Next slide. The man in the red box is, his name is Gregory also. He lives in 555 Edgecombe Avenue. He is a founder of the Black Rock Coalition. Also who lived in 555 to your right was Lena Horne, and Billy Strayhorn is with her. Billy Strayhorn was the love of Lena's life, but she couldn't have him because, next slide. The man sitting at the piano in the upper left, that's Aaron Bridges. That was Billy Strayhorn's lover, and so that was her competition. There you see Paul Robeson, who lived in number 16. A lot of people don't know that Lorraine Hansberry worked at number 16 with Paul Robeson back in the 1950s. And there you have the Brown Bomber, who lived on the 8th floor in 555 Edgecombe Avenue in the 1940s.